The lawyer's voice was calm, like he was reading from a grocery list, and the word adopted landed in my chest with the force of a door slamming. My name is Marcus Reed, I am 38, and for as long as I can remember I was my father's shadow fixing the shed roof on Saturdays, learning to change a tire in the driveway, sitting at his kitchen table while he taught me how to balance a checkbook. I worked as a project manager at a local firm, came home to the same creaky porch light, and spent holidays in the house where every picture on the mantel had us side by side. That routine, those small rituals, were the backbone of my life. I remember the exact tilt of his head the night he taught me to shave, the way he cupped a warm towel around my jaw to soften the stubble, murmuring instructions between sips of black coffee. His hands were wide and calloused and smelled like motor oil and pipe tobacco, and when he laughed he would clap me on the shoulder so hard my ribs would ache. I had been the one to patch the rust spots on his truck, the one who replaced the porch light because he always complained that ladders made his knees scream, the one who sat beside him through television reruns and storms. Those ordinary obligations and comforts built a scaffolding around my life until I took it for granted that scaffold was permanent. The law office smelled of lemon polish and newsprint, a scent that undercut every household memory I had of him. People shifted in the hard chairs around me, cousins whose faces blurred into a family album of weddings and funerals, neighbors who had lent him tools, a woman whose smile was practiced enough to register as new. My father's casket had been removed days earlier, but I could still feel the shape of him in the house, in the dent of his favorite armchair and the faint cologne that clung to a sweater I had wrung out while sorting through drawers. I thought I knew what grief felt like. It turned out grief could be complicated by the sound of a single syllable. As the lawyer read, I watched my hands. They looked smaller than they used to, or maybe the ring of my life felt suddenly different in my mind's eye. I tasted metal at the back of my tongue, and the office's fluorescent lights hummed a low, accusatory note. I tried to count the breaths between sentences to keep myself measured. The words washed over other relatives in waves, gasps, a whispered prayer, a sniffle, and then returned to me and struck harder, because I had been the one who sat on his lap during thunderstorms and had him wipe away a childhood scrape with the corner of his shirt. I had been his person. We had rituals that people assume are family by blood, like the way he carved my initials into the underside of the deck railing the summer I turned 12, or how he always cut the crusts off my sandwiches on road trips even when I protested. I learned to appreciate the small mercies of a life arranged by someone else's steady hand. I learned how to fix things because I did not want to owe anyone for repairs. I learned how to listen because he listened to me when my mother's divorce felt like a weather system I could not navigate. The sequence of those little commitments taught me a silent truth. Family was a set of mutual investings, not a certificate. Standing there, the document on the lawyer's table was a paper thing and also a vessel for something less tangible. The word adopted felt like someone had pried open a seam in the house and found a different foundation. I heard my own voice in the room, and it sounded distant, the way it does when you listen to an old answering machine tape, familiar but flattened. I thought about vacations we had taken, a picnic at the reservoir where he taught me to skip stones until I could match his rhythm, the Christmas when he stayed up all night assembling a bicycle because I refused to let him ask for help. I thought about the steady incompetence of certain relatives who now smiled too broadly as if inheritance were a sport. I had always joked that blood was the least interesting part of it. That joke was a shield, and for years it worked. I would say that my loyalty had been earned by presence, by persistence, by the accumulation of shared moments rather than by chromosomes. When I told friends about my father, I reached for details that proved our bond. The scar on his knuckle from a boxing mishap in his youth, the way he whistled off-key while pruning roses, the time he taught me to thread a needle in a shop lit only by a single dangling bulb. Those were the proofs I carried in my pockets. The silence in the office after the lawyer spoke widened into something I could step into. People rearranged themselves into conversations that did not include me. The hum of the air conditioning became the soundtrack of my own dislocation. My mouth tried to form questions, but they never quite made it past the guard of my throat. For a moment I imagined the house with the porch light off, his chair empty and unclaimed, as if a stranger had come in and moved the furniture to make new patterns. The pictures on the mantel still held our smiles, but in that instant they felt like snapshots in a shop window, pretty and unreachable. I realized then that my foundation could be called into question by someone else's words. That realization felt like falling and catching an edge with a single fingernail. I thought about the last thing he left me, not the physical objects but the life we had built in tiny habitual bricks, and how fragile those bricks appeared when someone else described the wall as built for a different man. Then the last thing he left me said otherwise. The will didn't just leave me out, it spelled out a reason with the cruel deliberateness of a teacher marking an exam. In neat blue ink, in a clause no one had ever hinted at in all the years of family jokes and shared chores, my father's attorney wrote the word that landed like a verdict. Adopted. Beneath it, the percentages and bequests were arranged as if they were the only facts that mattered. The majority of the estate, house, truck, savings was bequeathed to my older half-brother, James, and to Claire, who had moved into our life so quietly over the last 3 years that people had started calling her by a name that ended with mother. For a few seconds the room was a photograph you could step into. My cousins in their dark coats, the neighbors I'd helped twice with lawnmowers, a smattering of church friends, all holding the exact posture of polite sympathy. Then the sounds came, a thin, rehearsed intake of breath, a chair leg dragged in the kind of way people do to make noise when they cannot speak. James smiled like a man who had always assumed the crown was his. He shook hands with the attorney and with relatives and with me in a way that felt like he was test driving belonging he'd bought at auction. No one explained why the clause existed. No one offered the small kindness of disbelief on my behalf. Instead, explanations came in the spaces between sips of coffee and maneuvers of napkins. He thought it was best, Claire said, eyes round and steady, the practiced empathy of someone who had already arranged the next steps. We're just honoring his wishes. Her hand on the attorney's forearm had the ease of someone already rehearsed for the head of household role. James's mouth held that faint curl people mistake for sympathy but which is really, finally. The conversations around me narrowed into a channel of rumors that spread like mildew across wallpaper. There was the old uncle who muttered something about bloodlines in a tone meant to keep the comment casual and therefore sanctioned. A cousin who had always loved drama said with a small, gleeful smile that my father had always joked Marcus didn't take after him. A neighbor I'd fixed a fence for last summer dipped his head and said, as if offering comfort, "Well, you know how these things go." Those small severing remarks were delivered as if the problem were mine to manage, as if lineage could explain away the long sequence of Saturday afternoons and shared coffee mugs. People who once made space for me at family gatherings shifted their bodies so that there was an extra elbow room between me and the rest of them. Hugs were shorter. Eyes skimmed past me and landed on shoulders I no longer presumed to rest against. At the wake, someone from my father's bridge club put his hand on my shoulder and then, in a sentence too slow to be accidental, said, "You'll be all right, son," as if tacking a label on would make it true. I wanted to retort with the dozens of minor, indisputable proofs of our life together, the nights we stayed up fixing the roof, the way he taught me to change a tire in the rain, but the words clotted in my throat like oil. A voice in the hallway, too small to be heard by everyone, said, "There are always complications with estates." It wasn't sympathy, it was a protocol for dissolving discomfort. People exchanged glances as though we were all participating in a sanitation ritual, discreetly sanitizing emotions with small talk and then dismissing them. The lawyer smiled his professional smile and referred to the clause as if it were a medical fact. "These things are often straightforward legally," he said. Everyone else nodded, grateful for an authority that made things neat. What cut deeper than the redistribution of property was the way my presence was reframed. The mantel where our photos sat, me at 12 with a sunburn and him squinting like a man pleased to have engineered my misery away, suddenly felt like set dressing. Family members who had praised me for years for taking after my father's stubbornness now treated me as a charming anomaly, a funny footnote. Someone called me Marcus, the adopted one, in that lilt people use for tailies they find vaguely exotic and harmless. I felt like a word they'd use to tidy a closet. I was visible but locked behind glass. There were practical humiliations too. Claire took over the key arrangements and asked about utility accounts with an efficiency that sounded like finality. James began making plans, loud enough that other relatives could hear him outline renovations and the use of the garage as a workshop, our workshop, the one where he and I had stood shoulder to shoulder sanding the bench last summer. A stack of my father's tools gathered dust on the workbench that evening, and then, by morning, a few were missing. Each absence read like a footnote to the clause. Some possessions could be explained away by law, but the intangible ones, rituals, nicknames, the right to tell his stories, were not protected by statutes. At home, after everyone left, I wandered the rooms like a tenant inspecting a place I once owned. The porch light that had always clicked on with a familiar complaint hummed in the dark. I ran my fingers along the banister where he'd carved my initials under the deck and felt the purchase of the groove as if it were a map to a place that had been misidentified. I was holding the ordinary life we had built together, a life of lists and dinners and shared tasks, and for the first time it felt rented rather than owned, as if someone had signed a new lease and left me a single line in the margin saying I could stay as long as it pleased them. The numbness lasted exactly as long as the funeral hymn, long enough to blur the edges, but not long enough to stop the ache from hardening into something useful. For 2 days I floated through routines as if someone had replaced my limbs with borrowed ones. I made coffee and forgot to drink it. I loaded the dishwasher and let a cup sit in my hand until it cooled. People kept calling to check on me in a way that asked me to close the wound quietly. I figured I would, because what else did I have the capacity to do? Then, at the memorial lunch, my aunt, bless her, she'd always been blunt when kindness required a little cruelty, leaned across the table and said, casually, as if she were offering a recipe, "Your father always used to joke you didn't look like him." Her whisper was light enough that it could have been brushed aside, but it landed like a key in a lock that had been rusting for years. I felt the neat, polite grief around me become a room whose walls were suddenly transparent. The presence of people, the clink of silverware, the smell of lemon chicken, all those ordinary things took on an accusatory clarity. For the first time since the will was read, I understood what they were doing with that blue-worded clause. Not just rearranging money, but rearranging me. It wasn't only that they had disinherited me. It was the way they converted the private fact of our life into an argument, the way they tied my claim to a man I had watched die to some technicality that no one had seen fit to mention while he was alive. My father had taught me to shave on a stormy night when I was 15, holding the flashlight between his teeth and guiding me with a steady hand. He'd called me son more often than any official title. In his voice, that word meant repairs and small mercies and the inarticulate pride that comes from watching someone you built up take a step forward. That memory loosened something else inside me, not righteous anger at first, but a sharp, cold recognition that the story of us had been turned into evidence. "Your father always joked you looked nothing like him." The words repeated in my head like an echo off a canyon wall. I could suddenly see every one of those small, casual tuttings as collusion. They hadn't believed me enough to contest the clause when it mattered. Now they were using the idea of me as an outsider to justify erasure. That realization was strange. It was not the sky-burning, chest-cleaving moment I had imagined. It was quieter and more precise. It was like catching a map's forgery by tracing the borderlines with a fingernail. Once you see the cut, you can follow it. I thought of the things that would answer that doubt. A photograph doesn't convince the law. Testimony can be dismissed as biased, but biology, divorced from sentiment, has a way of being undeniably heavy. It occurred to me then that there was a concrete, sterile way to rebut the word that had been used against me. If blood in their mouths was the least interesting part of life, then let blood decide. Not to punish, not to embarrass, though there was a cold satisfaction in imagining faces that had been smug growing small, but to reclaim the truth of my life from a clause. There were practical questions. How would a test be arranged? Was it invasive? Would anyone be able to object? My mind, which had been dulled by grief, lit up with the kind of precise curiosity I'd always reserved for projects. I imagined a lab, a chain of custody form, signatures that would bind evidence to people. It felt almost silly how methodical I became, like a man dusting a countertop to see the scratch he'd been denying for years. The thought of challenging the paper, of forcing the legal record to reflect something it had dismissed as irrelevant, made my body shift into a posture I recognized from my old life: purposeful, competent. I considered other routes first. I thought of confronting James in front of the family, calling Claire out in the lawyer's office, demanding explanations like a man in a courtroom drama. But those felt performative, and worse, they would let them set the terms of the scene. I wanted to remove the theater altogether. A DNA test would be private, definitive, and it would leave them nothing to choreograph. It would not bring my father back or undo the loneliness of the last months. But it would finally answer the question that had been used to make me small. When I said the words to myself, "I'm going to get a DNA test," they felt both terrible and honest. The sentence was a small, plain instrument that fit the problem. Saying it aloud at the table, where people were sipping coffee that had gone cold, felt like the first time I had chosen a response that wasn't curated for other people's comfort. The room's chatter quieted for a moment, and eyes landed on me in a way that measured me, the way you measure a board before you cut. I didn't look for permission. I didn't wait for outrage or support. I simply tasted the decision like sour candy, sharp, bracing, unexpectedly clarifying. On the ride home, I rehearsed questions in my head. Where to go, what samples would be required, how to make sure it was admissible if needed. The list felt like the spine of a plan. For the first time since the will had been read, something about my future felt less like an inheritance granted or withheld by others and more like a thing I might steer. It wasn't spite, it was reclaiming. A small, stubborn refusal to accept a designation that hadn't been true in the life that counted. I sat on the porch until the evening cooled the wood beneath me. The mantel with the photos glowed in the doorway. My father's voice came back in flashes and annoyance at a misplaced hammer, a laugh at a joke that had nothing to do with us, and those memories felt, inexplicably, like proof. I rolled the idea of the test around in my mouth once more and felt, for the first time since the attorney's calm voice parceled out my life, a clear, level assurance settle into my chest. I knew what I had to do. I would get the test. And in that decision, small and surgical and entirely mine, I felt like I had done the first honest thing since the will had been read. I moved like the house expected me to be moving. Careful, absent-minded mourning with the right intervals of sighs and soft laughter when someone told a story. That made it possible. No one watched the edges of my work. No one worried about what I did in a spare hour under the pretense of sorting through sweaters or checking the shed for nails. If anyone asked why I was in the workshop for hours, I said I was looking for the old toolbox. People nodded and went back to complimenting the casserole. The workshop carried him the way a song carries a memory. Oil and sawdust, a faint citrus that had once been aftershave, and another sweetness from the tins of candy he kept on the shelf. I kept my hands low and moved slowly between the benches. I opened drawers that had not been opened in months. I found the half-used shaving kit jammed in a metal lunchbox, the razor tucked into its leather case, blades with his handprints in dried soap. I found a sweater pushed behind a stack of car magazines, the knit pilled where his elbows had rested, the collar still holding his scent. I wrapped both items in clean paper towels, folded them so they would not rub against anything else, and slid them into a zippered evidence bag I had ordered online. I did the reading in the nights. I read forums and state statutes until the lawyer in me, the project manager who once kept budgets and schedules, started drafting a sequence. Chain of custody mattered, the lawyer I hired told me when I first met him at a coffee shop where we sat at a corner table and watched the rain map the glass. If evidence is handled sloppily, he said, a judge will not even bother to see if it is true. I would need certified pickups, signed logs, sealed packaging, and a lab that would testify to every hand that touched a sample. My attorney's hands, when he set them on the folder he gave me, were the opposite of my father's rough, practical hands. They were soft and precise. He smiled without malice and said, "We do this cleanly, Marcus." Quietly. Quiet suited me. I found a private lab that offered court-admissible paternity testing and specified chain of custody procedures. They required intact items that could yield DNA without contamination, a log of where and when the items were collected, and witness signatures that would accompany the transport. I filled in forms, arranged the courier service, and printed 2 copies of everything. I learned how to seal an evidence bag so that any tampering would be obvious. I practiced folding the forms until the creases lined up like something made with intention. I hired a handwriting examiner the same week. The examiner wanted the original will and the codicil. I walked into the attorney's office with the thin, blue-inked paper in a manila envelope, and an odd calm settled over me. I had not expected to feel relieved handing it over. Maybe relief came from finally giving something away that had been making me hollow. The examiner promised to look not only at the signatures but at the pressure of the pen, the slant, the spacing, the small idiosyncrasies no one would notice unless they were trained to notice them. That was the point. Trained eyes turn ordinary things that people use to narrate a life into evidence that either holds or falls apart. I recorded conversations with my phone set to airplane mode when family came by. I did not hide it with intent to catch confessions. Mostly I wanted to document the casualness, the comments over coffee, the way names were dropped and stories were revised. I would play them back and find the small discrepancies. I made a habit of collecting receipts and logs too. who had delivered the flowers that day, who had arrived with a casserole, who had parked, and for how long. Medical visitation lists were harder to get, but a nurse at the hospice office, the one who had once smiled at me and called me Marcus in a way that felt like a bridge, told me which staff members had signed the bedside log. The attorney wrote a letter requesting records that would bear on who had been present in the last weeks. There was an art to being invisible. I did not go to family gatherings. I answered calls with a measured voice that pretended life could continue in a rhythm. I moved items into a lockbox at the attorney's office and signed the log every time I placed something there so that there was no question later about when those items left the house. I did not tell anyone that I had photographed the inside of the study at all angles, that I had cataloged where each picture frame had been. Little things that looked like grief were the best cover for investigation. Some nights I sat at the kitchen table with the evidence bags between my coffee cup and a stack of unpaid bills, and felt as if I were assembling pieces of a machine whose purpose I had only partly understood. I pretended I was preparing for a job I had done 100 times, a tender renovation that required patience rather than force. The sweater smelled faintly of him when I opened the bag. I held it and felt his shape in the wool, the curve of his shoulders, the memory of the way he would shrug it on after tinkering for hours in the garage. It felt obscene and necessary all at once. When the courier picked up the sealed evidence the morning the test was scheduled, I watched the van pull away with the same steady attention I had used to watch him drive away when he left for a job and promised to be back by supper. I locked the workshop and left no footprints that anyone would trace back to a motive. Everything looked as ordinary as a house left to its quiet routines. In my briefcase, the chain of custody forms rested like a ledger of intent. I had a handwriting examiner scheduled to begin analysis next week. I had recordings labeled and stored on a passworded drive. I had receipts and visitation logs photocopied and filed. I did not tell anyone what I had done. For now, the work was a private architecture, a careful placing of beams under a floor that might collapse. I made one last pass through the house before I left that evening, turned the porch light off, and felt the dark take the edges of things. The mantel with the pictures waited in the stillness. The setup was silent. My next move would be the lab's report. Until then, I could only wait and trust that small, precise actions add up to something larger than rumor. The courtroom was smaller than I had pictured and colder. The walls, painted a bureaucratic gray, seemed to suck the warmth out of the room. My lawyer sat to my left and folded his hands as if he were waiting for a train. My brother sat across the aisle with his new partner, the woman who had smiled at the reading and whose name had appeared on the codicil, as if she had been appointed a place at my father's table. She wore a stiff blouse and a face made for social media. When the bailiff called my case, the noise of the hallway went away and everything narrowed to the paper on my lap and the files in my attorney's briefcase. I presented the DNA report like a measured blow. The lab technician was precise and unflappable, the sort of person who talks in probabilities and certainties and seems almost proud of how unemotional that makes them. He explained the collection procedures, the chain of custody log that showed my signature, the pickup time stamped on the courier manifest, the sealed evidence bags whose tamper-evident features were intact. He walked the court through the extraction method, then the comparison, and finally the statistic that everyone in the gallery heard as if it were a verdict. The match probability was effectively conclusive. It was not dramatic. It did not land with a shout. It landed the way a stone lands in a still pond and then changes everything by the rings it makes. People in the courtroom shifted. My brother's jaw tightened. The woman clasped and unclasped her hands as if she were trying to keep something inside. My attorney put the DNA report on the judge's desk and did not say more than he needed to. I could feel the room counting the silence after numbers. Then the handwriting expert took the stand. She had a little loop on a chain and a calm that suggested she had spent a career reading other people's certainty for what it was. She laid copies of the contested codicil next to exemplars of my father's known signatures. She pointed out things most laypeople do not see, the rhythm of a pen, the pressure points where the nib dug in and released, the way an unpracticed hand might hesitate on an unfamiliar stroke. She showed the judge magnified reproductions and explained the coaching patterns she believed she had identified, strokes that began with a different lead-in, letters that matched another hand in their hesitation. She did not accuse with thunder. She outlined probabilities, anomalies, and then the critical observation that the signature on the codicil contained features inconsistent with the rest of my father's handwriting and consistent with someone copying or prompting. My brother's face changed as the evidence accumulated. The smile that had always seemed born of entitlement slackened and then fell away into something like the hollow look of a man watching a roof fall in slow motion. His throat moved. He tried to meet my eyes and then dropped them. The woman oscillated between indignation and composure. When the handwriting expert described the coaching, her lips pressed together so hard the color drained from her cheeks. We also introduced hospital visitation logs and a nurse who had been candid about who had been at my father's bedside, times and names that conflicted with the timeline my brother's camp had offered. My attorney cross-referenced the visitation signatures with photos and receipts, and a pattern emerged. An unusual intensity of presence from a narrow circle in the days when the contested codicil appeared. That pattern, paired with the handwriting anomalies and the DNA result, created a lattice of evidence that did not need me to narrate it into being. At one point, my brother's lawyer stood, palms up, and tried to recast the lab numbers as an unfortunate coincidence and the handwriting quirks as normal variation. He argued that the late changes to the will were the product of a muddled elder who had been swayed by different voices. The handwriting expert, who had been trained in precisely that kind of obfuscation, replied with the clear language of someone whose job was to cut through plausible stories and get back to ink and movement. The lab tech shrugged his shoulders at the suggestion of coincidence and confirmed the sealed chain of custody beyond any reasonable doubt. I did not stand up and shout. I did not throw the signed photos on the judge's desk. I had rehearsed restraint because I knew that rage could look like motive. I let the reports and the witnesses do the pointing. Evidence is not theatrical. It is arithmetic and pressure and timestamps. It does the work of changing minds without the melodrama. When the judge finally leaned forward and rendered a ruling that felt like the crack of a gavel and the softening of a bruise, he said he had sufficient cause to set aside the contested portions of the will pending a full inquiry into undue influence. He ordered the estate frozen in those parts and directed that an independent investigator be appointed to examine the conduct surrounding the codicil. He listened to a few procedural motions, signed an order that would become a public paper trail, and then called for a recess. My brother slumped in his chair. The woman who had been the loudest in the lunchroom that spring lowered her head. Family members who had been their chorus in court shifted and avoided looking at me. The quiet that followed the judge's words was not the same as the quiet that follows a verdict in a story, the dramatic hush that signals triumph. It felt more like the hush at a funeral reception when someone brings out a tray of too sweet cookies and the conversation has nowhere to go. Outside the courtroom, the winter air hit my face and felt clean as if it were trying to wash the smell of the room away. I did not gloat. I did not allow myself a smile. I felt a hollow, a strange free space where the story of who I was had been uncertain for so long. The papers would write about chains of custody and contested codicils, about how evidence can rewrite assumed truths. Those facts would comfort me enough to continue, but they did not stitch up the part of me that missed my father for reasons that had nothing to do with law. I walked to my car with the folder heavy in my hand and thought only that proving the truth had opened a door I could not close, and that the rest would require patience and the slow, exacting work I had learned to do in workshops and on kitchen tables. The redistribution took longer than anyone promised. Paperwork multiplied like mold in a forgotten toolbox. There were meetings with estate accountants, interviews with the investigator, and depositions that felt like reliving the same uncomfortable monologue until even memories stared back at me bored. The judge signed the orders that recognized me as an heir, and the contested portions were struck from the record. My brother was arraigned on charges related to undue influence, and the probe into the codicil became part of the public file. He pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor and received probation, restitution, and a warning written in the dry language of a courtroom. The woman who had been catty at family lunches moved out of town and then out of my life. Blocked numbers and curt emails replaced the holiday banter that had once filled the house. People kept asking me if I felt vindicated. I tried to answer honestly and kept finding words that sounded small and inadequate. Was I relieved? Yes. Was I satisfied? Less so than I expected. What I kept was the quiet confirmation that a life you live cannot be erased by a line on a page. That fact settled into me not like a triumphant chord but like a slow, steady heartbeat. The law returned property and title and a name on a deed. It did not return his laugh or the particular way he said my name when he wanted me to listen. It did not deliver a confession from him because he could not speak for himself anymore. The victory had edges and angles I had not foreseen. In the weeks that followed, I found myself doing work that felt more like maintenance than triumph. I changed the lock on the back door because the legal paperwork listed people who no longer belonged in our house. I sorted through boxes of tools and arranged them by weight and use, as if by putting his screwdrivers in order I could keep a sequence of him intact. I returned 1 or 2 heirlooms to distant relatives whose names had been cleared when the codicil was removed. I kept the shaving kit and the faded sweater I had used in my tests. They smelled faintly of him for a long time and then slowly lost even that, until they smelled like linens and laundry soap and the ordinary life that follows a decisive change. Family gatherings did not return to any earlier shape. Invitations were sent and then rescinded. A nephew who had been an ally withdrew to his own life and sent me a message about trying to keep the peace in his own household. My aunt called once and then stopped answering. There were a handful of people who stayed in small ways, the kind of loyalty that shows up as a casserole or a text that says I am thinking of you. Those gestures mattered more than any lawyer could quantify. The family had been a body with a flank missing, and it did not quite reknit. It developed a scar tissue that made some movements impossible. I thought a lot about the days I had spent assembling evidence. I had told myself I was doing it for truth, not revenge, but the truth became a strange companion. It soothed some of the rawness, yes, but it also demanded things. It asked that I live more honestly in plain moments. It required me to stop performing grief to suit other people's expectations. I began, slowly, to sift the life my father and I had made from the one the papers had tried to invent. I reclaimed dinner rituals that did not need witnesses. I fixed the creaky porch light and replaced a burnt bulb without calling a relative to brag. I balanced a checkbook and thought of him as I did so, not as a ghost to prove, but as a teacher whose lessons still fit the practical contour of my days. There were quieter lessons that emerged only with time. The legal victory had been public and sharp, and for a while I luxuriated in the small, private pleasures of sitting at my kitchen table with a mug and a notebook, jotting down mundane things he used to ask me to record. It felt like a continuation rather than a contest. I learned that proving the truth heals differently than revenge. Proof settles certain accounts, yes, but it does not reconcile the absence of a voice. Revenge would have been theatrical, a set piece for other people to consume. The proof was less show than scaffolding. It allowed me to stand where I needed to stand and to begin, slowly, to rebuild other parts of my life that were not tied to courtroom drama. My brother's legal troubles made him a cautionary figure at family law seminars and a bad story at neighborhood barbecues. He sent a letter once, contrite and brief, asking if we could speak. I read it in the morning and folded it into the pile of mail, and then I watched his name for a while like someone watching a tide. I declined to meet him, not because of pride or vindictiveness, but because meeting him would have been an act that implied reconciliation might follow confession. I was not sure I wanted to make that promise to anyone, least of all to someone whose choices had so significantly altered the map of my life. There were small vindications that had nothing to do with courtroom orders. A neighbor came over and told me his boy had learned to change a tire at my suggestion, and the neighbor's smile was the kind my father used to have when he watched me figure something out. A young woman in a store complimented the sweater I had worn, and I told her, without thinking, that it had been my father's. She said something about the luck of that and went on. Those slips of ordinary life felt like repairs more than any legal restitution had. In the end, integrity for me became less about the dramatic unmasking and more about the steady, stubborn accumulation of small truths. It was the daily choice to say what had happened to me and then to show by the way I lived that the story was true. It was fixing a porch light because it needed fixing, not because the act would prove anything. It was keeping the shaving kit on the bathroom shelf as a private relic rather than a trophy. It was attending to the work of being a good steward of what he had left, which turned out to be as much about habit and presence as about assets. I do not know what the future will make of the relationships that remain. I do know that when I stand in the workshop at dusk and run my hand over a plane of wood and feel the familiar grooves and stains, I feel less like someone whose place was argued over on paper, and more like someone who belongs to a life he built with another man. The evidence did more than restore an estate. It restored a principle I had once taken for granted, that truth is worth the quiet, incremental labor of finding and keeping.